I'm delighted to be back with a pleasant guest, and I'm fairly sure neither of us are going to call the other an idiot or get into any of the stuff that we had earlier today with Alan Dershowitz. Lee, how are you?
I'm doing great, Jason. Yeah, if this goes worse than the Dershowitz thing, something's gone very, very wrong.
It's not going to happen. You've just completed another episode of The Backstory on Sputnik Radio. I was listening, very interesting, some insights from a Russian doctor about the COVID-19 situation. But there's been a lot of news. I was confused by this, Lee. I heard that there was this, big cyber hack, but I gotta say, I'm feeling a little bit like Boy Who Cried Wolf. They've been talking about Russia hacking forever with no evidence. What indication do we have that this occurred?
None.
Oh.
So and I talked about this in the show today, but as soon as I saw this story, I want people to realize that there's two stories right now, parallel stories. One is about this guy, Alexander Navalny. He's a supposed Russian opposition leader. I'll talk about that. That's mostly in Europe. Then there's this story here about this hack. So the problem is we are in such a propagandized media environment that I am seeing people, including President Trump, make what I consider a really silly error, which is President Trump tweeted the other day after Mike Pompeo and William Barr came out and said, yep, there's this hack and it's Russia, right? And Trump said, I've seen the evidence and this is way overblown. Then he said, but it's China. Now, you can't have it both ways. I mean, he can because he's President Trump, but you can't have it both ways. There is literally, and I talked about this in the show today, with the Russiagate narrative, for instance, at least we had evidence that something happened. So just at a bare minimum, WikiLeaks released emails that they got from somebody, right? So let's start with that. And we could see the emails, we could read them. So we knew that something had happened. Now, who did it? There's a lot of questions after that, but let's just start right there, okay? And so if I said to you, Jason, someone has been breaking into your apartment at night and going around the house and you're like, oh my God, that sounds horrible. How do you know? And I'm like, well, let's just say I know.
Because I'm here and nothing's gone.
Right, nothing's gone.
Broken.
Nothing. So until they actually produce anything, and they've literally not produced one thing except press releases and op-eds.
Right.
And these are the same people behind the disinformation over and over again. Here's my position. I need more. Otherwise, I assume this is purely narrative. And I'll talk about the reason for the narrative in a second, because it's a very clever narrative, which is setting up for future events. Because let's say I said, for instance, well, this person, he's been breaking into your house. You go, I haven't seen any evidence at all. I checked my security cams. I go, well, you don't even know how far they've infiltrated you, Jason. Let's see what happens. And then let's say you're out for pizza a year from now, and suddenly your apartment's burgled.
Not going to be surprised.
I say, aha, see, this is Now, if it turned out that I was the person who burgled your apartment, then you would go, well, wait a second. When he told me that thing about somebody rocking around, he was setting me up, right? So he could then later say, oh, you were burgled, but he did it. So what they've set up for on this hack is that there's no proof of. And literally they're saying this in op-eds, and Intel saying this, we don't even know how far Russia has infiltrated. We have no idea. We don't know what they're going to do in the future. They've said that. And that tells me something's going to happen in the future, and they're going to blame it on Russia. And we already see Biden saying, I'm going to take this seriously from day one. I'm going to do things. I'm going to sanctions. Already saying that in a speech today.
Wow.
Now, add the fact, and by the way, this narrative, but the worst part is I have not seen one single person,
Right.
and a lot of people are following Trump's lead. They immediately go, no, it's China. No, no, don't, and you could pick a country. See, one of the reasons they say that it's Russia or a state actor, I'm gonna name another country, Israel. Am I saying it's Israel? No, I'm not saying it's Israel because I don't see anything happening. Here's what I'm saying. Israel absolutely has the technical capabilities to do this, right? They do. There's not a question in the world. It's not like, Barbados or something where they may not have the ability to do it. Even if you say it's a state actor, there could be multiple state actors. So if I didn't like Israel, and I have questions about Israel, but leave that aside. If I didn't like Israel and I just came out and said, no, it's Israel, I'm committing the same error. And it's a mistake to do that. I have big problems with the UK, for instance. UK intelligence interfered in our election. I'm not blaming UK. I'm saying I'm seeing a bullshit narrative get set up that they're doing on purpose to set up for future things. If something happened, to me, the most likely culprit at this point is going to be the deep state, the CIA or somebody.
Absolutely.
Setting themselves up. Now let's talk about the Navalny case. Alexander Navalny is supposedly a Russian opposition leader, but he has almost no support in Russia whatsoever. And he was poisoned a few months ago. And now he says, now the poisoning is being used to sanction Russia. And once again, it's a narrative. Now, he recently came out with audio where he said he's talking to a KGB agent.
Poison in his underwear?
Right, FSB agent, yes.
What's that about?
He's saying that they took Novichok, which is this deadly remember the Skripal case?
Yes, right.
Novichok, when that story came out, they told us Novichok will kill you in 10
seconds.
You
went there to the town where that all happened, right?
To Salisbury, yes. And no one there bought the narrative. And there's a lot about that, by the way. And I'll come back to it in a second. But that Novichok story with Skripal was everything we heard about Novichok. First off, it sounds scary and Russian.
Yes.
Right? And it's Novichok. It sounds like a Bond villain.
Yep.
Right?
Absolutely.
Vladimir Novichok. You will pay, Mr. Bond, whatever it is. and so now it turns out, apparently you can take this Novichok, put it in someone's underwear, and apparently their gonads have a sort of antidote effect because the dude didn't die. You would think if you had Novichok,
you might itch.
Right. You'd think there'd be an issue. In fact, I pointed this out that if you think about it, Navalny's Novichok nuggets sounds like a Christmas treat. It sounds like something you get at the mall. They give
it's like sweaty balls. Remember that?
Sweaty balls, exactly right. Yeah. so this story, on the face of it, is absurd.
I agree.
Let's go back a step. A friend of mine said this to me after my show today. He said, let's just go to a tradecraft perspective. Who was in the room going, I've got an idea. Let's put Novichok in his underwear. And someone's like, oh, okay, well, hang on. It's a great idea, Ivan. But how do we...
Sketch that out for me. How's that?
Yeah. Well, how do we, play it out for me. How do we know what underwear he's going to wear? Do we just leave it there and no,
Why not just shoot him?
Yes. Yeah. Can we push him in front of a truck?
Right.
No.
What's with all this? But wait, Lee. Another question, though, because whenever I hear these ridiculous stories, and I agree with you, the United Kingdom is up to a lot of tricky business. Wasn't Christopher Steele the contact or the handler for that guy who got poisoned at the sushi place?
You're very well. Hang on. It's worse. So we talked about that last week.
Yeah.
Why is Vladimir Putin an evil monster? There's a short list of things they always say. Syria, Ukraine, Crimea, the Litvinenko poisoning, the Navalny poisoning, his pursuit of Bill Browder. Now, when I've looked into those things, they're all lies, every one of them. I know the Syria one from when I went to Lebanon in 2013, and I could see the BS there firsthand. Russia's on the right side in Syria, period. They're on the right side. And they're on the side that I wish the U.S. were on, and that the U.S. should have been on. But okay, leave that aside, the anti-Al-Qaeda side. But this story about Litvinenko, as I pointed out last week, who was once again poisoned in a sushi restaurant, the guy who said that Litvinenko was poisoned by Putin was Christopher Steele.
Right.
Now, a couple minutes ago, I mentioned the Skripal poisoning. Sergei Skripal was a Russian double agent. He was an agent. Then he turned on Russia and became a British spy, right? A double agent. And then he was brought over to England. His handler, Jason, was a guy named Pablo Miller.
Right. You told me about that.
Pablo Miller, if you look him up,
Doesn't
first
sound
off,
British.
Yes, it may not, but it is. So Miller, when his name first started to come out in the Skripal case, in the UK, they issued what's called a D notice. A D notice says, don't talk about this. They send it out to the media. They say, don't talk about Pablo Miller. Okay? Wow. So that's A. So that's a little suspicious.
Who knew
right there.
that even exists?
But look, if you look into Pablo Miller, you'll see he's a partner with Christopher Steele in Orbis Communications.
Oh. You know, I've been in there. Orbis Business Intelligence. I went and visited and walked right up to the office.
To where? To
in
Orbis?
London, to Orbis Intelligence. There was an American girl, pretty young and attractive, working there. Struck me as, maybe CIA.
I couldn't find Orbis. I've been to London a few times. You did better than me. I tried to find it. I was walking around. As you know, the London street system is Byzantine.
It's
and
difficult.
Kind of literally. I couldn't find Orbis. But Pablo Miller was Sergei Skripal's handler. Furthermore, he lived about a half mile from Skripal in Salisbury. And you're not allowed to talk about it. The British media immediately said, don't talk about Pablo Miller. So the fact that Steele and his company Orbis, here's what Orbis is clearly. If you're British intelligence, you have certain rules you're supposed to follow, right? So it's the same thing here. Like the CIA, right? It's a private version of British intelligence, which allows them to do things and have a degree of separation from British intelligence, and to do things British intelligence couldn't do. So anybody, and I've always said this, in the Russiagate narrative, people in the U.S., if they were telling the story of Russiagate, which people on the right call Spygate,
right?
Spygate people never mention the Skripal case, and because the thing about the Spygate people, Solomon, Bongino, Sarah Carter, all the people pushing that Spygate narrative are intentionally misleading people. They get a lot of the story right, and then they veer off because they always need to demonize Russia. And again, my show's on Radio Sputnik. You can, if people want to give an ad hominem, which is what Bongino does, well, he works for Russia or what, he says stuff like that, which I don't get any Russia control, anything. Nothing. I get a paycheck for doing a show that I produce on my own. It's awesome. But if you don't believe me, if you go, well, I'm skeptical, just go look it up. Go look up Pablo Miller's Skripal. You'll find it. Go look up the fact that Steele was actually Litvinenko's handler. And the Skripal thing happened when Steele was running the Russian office. So this happens over and over again, which leads to a good question. Why was Skripal taken out? And I don't know the answer to that.
Is he dead? He is? I thought he survived.
He did survive. Do you know where he is?
I don't know.
Me neither.
England. Oh.
The Brits are hiding him. And
really?
I'm not joking. And his daughter. And if you really want to get into that, there were phone calls between his daughter and an aunt. And the daughter was trotted out by the British. The daughter was over visiting him. And she had a fiance, and suddenly she's not going back to Russia. So I'm going to argue that Yulia Skripal and her father, Sergei Skripal, are effectively political prisoners in the UK right now.
Wow.
They
But they also gave her some kind of tracheotomy, right? She had a real major surgery.
She had surgery, and then she was talking to her aunt in Russia, and those phone calls were recorded. And she was like, and at first she was mad at her aunt because she was like, I don't want to be in the middle of this controversy, and you talk to the media and put me there. Then in a later phone call, about a week later, she said, I figured out what's going on. I'm sorry. I'm not mad at you. And she had, I think, figured out that she's been played here. But the whereabouts of Yulia and Sergei Skripal are unknown. They're being hidden by the British government. Again, nobody talks about this. Nobody talks about this.
Well, actually, sorry to interrupt, Lee, but this did come up with David Hawkins because this interview with Yulia Skripal is really unusual. It's, she's not a native English speaker, and just the what she's saying and how it's being said, it feels very staged.
No, right. It's very staged. But again, do you hear anybody in the American media
don't even know who they are? Yeah.
Talk about this? Nobody. No. Nobody. And it's part of, and that's why we'll talk more about the Browder thing. But this is a good preface for that. This is why the Browder thing is so important. People need to understand there is a decades-long propaganda campaign against Putin that has nothing to do with the things they say they're against Putin for. It has to do with an economic agenda, and that's where the Browder stuff, and we'll get into the Shearer stuff a little bit today as well. That's what people need to understand. And again, I'll say this over and over. Don't fall into it. Everybody, and I did it too. Even people who are like, they go, I don't believe the Russiagate narrative, that's a bunch of BS, blah, blah, blah. They end up repeating things that aren't true. And they end up going, Russia's obviously, Putin's a monster, but I don't think they did that.
Right.
And my question for them is, and seriously, why do you think Putin's a monster? Like, ask yourself.
Nobody ever knows. No one has an answer.
Or they'll go, the Litvinenko case. And every time you look into it, you go, well, that's the story promoted by this guy. We talked about this last week, who's known Bill Clinton since he was at Oxford. And again, I don't think it's an accident that it happened in the UK and at Oxford. And that's a deeper part of this narrative. But people really ask yourself, if you're going, well, it's China, why do you think what you think about China right now? And again, I'm a lot more critical of China than I am, but I'm nuanced critical of it. And I know that the deep state would much rather have you talk about Russia and China than to talk about Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UK, and the US. That's what they want you to talk about. They don't want you to talk about the other stuff. And of course, you had a nice conversation with Alan Dershowitz today. Dershowitz 100% ties in the Epstein thing with a explicitly pro-Israeli policy. We talked about Genie Energy last week. That's the energy company that has exclusive drilling rights to the Golan Heights. They were given it years ago by Netanyahu, who's very close with Charles Kushner. And when I say very close, I mean as close as you can be. He slept at the Kushner house. So I don't mean they met once and there's a photo. I mean,
he even said it at the White House. I found it bizarre that he would say that.
Yeah. Well, because there's no consequence in it. The media, they pretend that they'll make feints, FEINTS. They'll make feints. They'll feint a blow at Jared Kushner. If they want to take Jared Kushner down, the Genie Energy thing is a blatant example of corruption. This is a company that had exclusive drilling rights to the oil under the Golan. It's directly connected to Kushner. Furthermore, Kushner brought the president of Genie Energy, Ira Greenstein, into the White House, worked there. He was part of a group of people that was vetting as well. But then he later worked at the White House, where he was close to guys like Steve Bannon and Seb Gorka, who I used to work with at Breitbart. Huh. Then the first move is that they tried to use missiles against Syria, and Kushner's the guy who pushed for that in the White House. Remember that? We shot missiles. We just did it in an airport. When that failed, they continued the false narrative against Syria. Assad's a monster, blah, 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 that whole thing. They continued to fool people into thinking that we were fighting al-Qaeda when, in fact, we're supporting them. The U.S. is supporting al-Qaeda. There's actually not any question about it if you look into it. In the Idlib province, we're supporting the rebels. The rebels are al-Qaeda. They're Sunni fundamentalist Wahhabis backed by Saudi Arabia, very explicitly, and by Israel. And if people doubt that, and you'll just look it up, Jason, you'll see it. All people have to do is just try doing a search for Al-Qaeda, Syria, Israel hospital. That should do it. And you'll find stories in mainstream publications, and including Israeli publications, that say Al-Qaeda forces were given medical aid by Israel.
Here it is in the Times of Israel.
Right. So
that's as mainstream as it gets over there, right?
Exactly right. Yes. And look what the headline is. They acknowledge it. So that's not a conspiracy theory, right? That's the Times of Israel reporting the government of Israel acknowledged it.
How come people aren't freaking out about that?
Because they don't hear it. And that's why I say, if the media really wanted to take out Jared Kushner.
Well, let me ask you something, Lee, because you've just reminded me of something that I discovered earlier in the week. The whole Bill Browder story has now tied into all of David Hawkins' research, because apparently Bill Browder was in direct communication with Cameron Ortis, the RCMP guy, and I discovered that Bill Browder worked for Robert Maxwell's MCC conglomerate. What is that?
That's exactly right. Bill Browder got his start with Ghislaine Maxwell's father.
That's crazy.
When I wasn't really following the Epstein story for a long time. Then around the time he got arrested, and I heard about Ghislaine Maxwell, who I'd never heard of her before. I just was pursuing other stories. I immediately was like, oh my God. Okay. The fact that Browder is connected to Maxwell, and Maxwell is once again as connected as you can be to Israel. There's a book called Robert Maxwell, Super Spy.
Right.
It's hard to find, but I have a copy of it. As connected as you can be, Robert Maxwell was given honors. He had like 3 funerals in Israel when he died.
How about this with Rupert Murdoch, who publishes loads of weird stories about Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell?
That's exactly right. And who's also a supporter of Bill Browder's and the Magnitsky Act. I said, go to Open Secrets, look up News Corporation Magnitsky, you'll find it. News Corporation funded it. And see, that's one of the things it's the only reason, if this sounds a little confusing and mind-blowingly complex, it is actually not that complex. But the problem is, it's as I said before, one of the advantages of you and I talking every week here is that if you jump in the middle of a soap opera, if you say, oh, I've heard a lot about Game of Thrones, let me just start to watch season 3, episode 6. That's where I'm going to start.
It makes no sense.
It makes no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense. And the difficulty is that as a journalist, I'm speaking to an audience that is comprised of 2 groups of people. People who've been following my work for a while, have looked into it themselves, and know that everything I'm saying is not only true, but 100% provably true. Every single point that I'm making, it's not hidden, it's not tricky. And that's part of the audience, and it's, depending on the show I'm doing, either a small part or a big part. But it's also comprised of people who get 1,000 news sources a day Because whether you like it or not, CNN is part of your news environment. I mean, if you don't, people say, "Well, I don't watch Fox and I don't watch CNN." Doesn't make any difference whether you individually watch it or not. And I would
Because they're putting that info out there.
yes, and I would suggest you do. And I would, I read and listen to every single news source.
Now, let me pause you for a second, Lee, because a lot of people are joining us now who maybe haven't seen previous episodes. We've just brought back High Dive with Lee Stranahan, which is another one of these sponsor-exclusive shows, and we're about to make the transition right now over to patreon.com/Stranahan, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. People will be able to pick up the rest of the conversation there. We're going to go into depth on Bill Browder, the Maxwells, all this stuff with the United Kingdom, but we're going to take a pause here, and we'll be back in less than 5 minutes. We'll see everybody over there. Thanks for